Hi everyone, I just thought I'd take a break from the normal content to read out this trip report that I penned the other week. It was actually the third anniversary of this mind-bending, life-changing trip that I had that completely transformed my life down a whole new direction. So, without further ado, let's get stuck into it. To preface these series of events, I thought I'd share some of the experiences I've had that led up to what would be the most fucked up night of my life. I'm 23 years old and have had vast experience of psychoactive substances, from DMT to meth and everything in between. Early on in my drug-taking pursuits around 2014, I was just about coming out of my shell in terms of my social interactions with people. Throughout high school I was plagued with what I now know was moderate to sometimes severe autism. I rarely engaged in activities outside of my computer, and most of my best friends at the time were people I spoke to over Skype. It wasn't until sixth form that I properly began going to parties, which there were a whole lot of around here where I live in the Lancaster area. The first night I took a Gary, what we call ecstasy tablets in the north, was absolutely life-changing. This experience diverged my path in life down several years of seshing, slang for partying, and experimenting with substances of all my mates who I met through the sesh. We were all absolute fuckheads and did a lot of questionable shit looking back, but the majority of it was all great fun and hilarious to look back on and see how we've matured as people. Once we began to discover psychedelics, they became our instant drug of choice for raves, parties and nights out. We were all hooked on the sheer hilarity of these twisted substances. They were completely different to any other conventional recreational drug. Everything was all sunshine and rainbows for many years whilst experimenting with LSD, mushrooms, DMT, 4-ACO DMT and any other psychedelic you can name really. Except for the time I pissed myself in my mate's mum's bed during my first ego death experience on acid and super potent weed. That was pretty messed up. And for ages after that insane experience, I desperately tried to figure out what had truly happened to me. I began to thoroughly research what the deal was with consciousness and how psychedelics tie into the nature of reality, as well as what was actually going on with all these altered states and why science doesn't like to comment on their validity. My mate, who had another similar chaotic ego death experience, where he jumped from my balcony, shattered a table and attempted to dig into the earth with his bare hands, was also super into this with me. This led us to further experimentation with higher doses of psychs, focusing more on the introspective aspects of the experience rather than the recreational, although we did get fucked up a lot at festivals. It got to a point where I thought I could use psychedelics in any environment, whilst also safely downloading information from the source of reality. How wrong I was. The date was November 11th, 2017. I was 20 at the time. It was the day before my holiday to Prague with 3 of my best mates, and also the night of a drum and bass bassline event at a venue in Manchester known as the Antwerp Mansion. This was an infamous club deep within the Curry Mile, which was a nickname for a long stretch of road through Rusholme, South Manchester. I knew I really shouldn't be going out the day before my holiday, but alas, the ego went out and I foolishly indulged. I was highly self-indulgent back then. We were all at our mate's flat who went to university in Manny, getting majorly west off care, acid, MDMA, weed, etc. Pick your poison and someone was on it. There were about 10 of us who were going to this rave, so we geared ourselves up and consumed the majority of our substances before heading out to the venue. We were wary of the security at the event finding anything on us upon entry, so we thought this was our safest option. It really wasn't. I ended up consuming 250 UG tabs, smoked several joints, and had Ket on the way to the event. Our mate Keko was a serious Ket fiend, and took such a ridiculous amount that resulted in him constantly speaking in sheer gibberish the entire duration of our journey, and being unable to walk properly. Things were already off to a bad start. Some of us had to help haul him all the way to the venue, which was a good hour's walk away. Throughout the trek, we were all rapidly coming up off the chemicals we'd ingested, and it became so intense that we ended up walking past the event and getting split up. The area we were in was causing us a great deal of paranoia. We were getting a myriad of dodgy looks from passers-by, although I can't blame them, we must have looked like fucking weirdos. This was made even worse when Keka pissed on a building that turned out to be a mosque. We were lucky nobody saw. When we got split up, I was with Keka and my mate Crosshatch when I first started to notice the visuals vastly intensify and my ego beginning to dissolve. I said to the boys that I was going to walk back to the flat and ride out the experience. I was starting to feel exactly like how I did in my mate's mum's bed when I pissed myself. I wasn't in any fit mental state to go to a rave. They managed to convince me otherwise. When we rocked up at the queue, each of us got separated within it, and I was left alone to mindfuck myself into oblivion. Whilst queuing up in the dingy alleyway leading up to the dilapidated manor, I started having intense notions of having experienced infinite realities, cycling through them as clear as day in my mind's eye. I began to heavily attach myself to one reality and tamper with the ego death, which was one where Keka had been run over by a car. I started to think and talk to myself like this had fully just happened, that Keka's head had just been crushed by a car. I began mentioning it to some people with varying reactions, some of them telling me to get fucked, which I can't blame them for. I was acting like a complete lunatic. I kept waving my ticket around asking if people knew if it had any information on my friend, who I presumed was dead. When I eventually regrouped with everyone, I was struck with an intense wave of peace, and I almost recouped my ego back from its demise. Seeing that Keka hadn't died was a massive relief, and I did return to a state of sanity for a brief while, until I became so entranced by the music and dancing that I began to merge with everything once again. At this point, the hallucinations started to get immensely surreal and dreamlike. I looked at the DJ and perceived his twiddling of the dials on the controller as a paramedic defibrillating someone on a stretcher. They were bleeding out majorly. In fact, all the walls and floors and people's faces seemed to be bleeding away. It truly felt like reality was unfolding upon itself. Whilst looking at everyone dancing, I noticed that everybody had a certain aura to them, and each of them with a greater aura had a more filled out, fantastical, detailed appearance. This was in contrast to the people who didn't have that same aura going on. They appeared like blank, fully black humans with no facial features, almost like an icon for an unlockable character in a video game like Smash Bros. It felt as if I was tapping into infinite intelligence and perceiving each person's karmic backlog as if it was my own as well. Each an individual strand of infinite consciousness, experiencing itself and constantly growing and evolving whilst also being one thing and nothing simultaneously, of which I was as well. This incredible revelation was met with the most unfortunate outcome. Me and Crosshatch walked to another area of the mansion, which was playing some of the most hypnotically bassy drum and bass and bassline tunes I'd ever heard. It's a true testament to the power of psychedelics and how they amplify the effects of music, films, etc., just generally all sensory experience. It was so mesmerising, in fact, that I ended up deciding I didn't even need my phone anymore and lobbed it across the room, much to Crosshatch's surprise. Shortly after this incident, I was started on by this random guy who began to push me about and give me shit for seemingly no reason, and people started to defend me whilst I had absolutely no clue what was real and what wasn't. This stressful encounter inspired me to get some fresh air, possibly the worst mistake of my life. I walked out of the venue and set about strolling down the long stretch of road outside, taking in all the vivid fractals that divided infinitely in every corner of my vision. I began to have the insight that reality is completely conscious and interconnected on all levels, both high and low. That this is what all the world's religions and shamanistic practices have been pointing towards. But the truth is hidden after being distilled by the ego. Despite this, it is all part of infinite consciousness's intelligence and desire to live through itself in every form possible by dreaming up infinite realities, all in a bid to experience and love itself in every imaginable way, even in the most unbelievably twisted manners we wouldn't egoically perceive as being good. My whole life experiences and interests began to merge with my environment. I saw the refracting triangle off the dark side of the moon extending deep into the abyss of visuals deep beneath my feet, and noticing imagery similar to the movie The End of Evangelion, which initially inspired my spiritual pursuits when I was younger. I felt like I was creating my own sandbox video game through my senses. This was coupled with visions of cars and people that began to move in loops back to their previous point over and over again. I tried talking to several people on my journey, but to no avail. They all spoke back to me in tongues, or seemed to be my own consciousness talking through them, asking me about where my life was going and all the things I had done that only I knew. That was particularly weird and still sticks with me to this day. At some point during this mind-bending journey, I decided to rid myself of all my clothes, losing my wallet and glasses in the process. I had nothing to hide. For the first time in my life, I truly let go. In this dreamlike, timeless reality, I vividly heard all my mates' voices beckoning me back to Antwerp, so I started to sprint. Along the way, a man ran towards me and ended up punching me square in the face, disorienting me big time, but also jolting me with adrenaline enough to run across the road, parkouring over cars and walls like some serious Mirror's Edge shit. This happened for what felt like a millennia. I had some disturbing thoughts that made me start running towards a bus to return back to a stage of formlessness, but thankfully I decided against it. It felt like my ego was so far gone that death wouldn't be any different from what I was experiencing right now in this timeless void. I also remember going into a shop naked and drinking a can of Fanta grape whilst being chased around the shop by the cashier. Then after that, I ran into a shisha bar and had a puff on one before darting back out. I had no sense of other and did all this gleefully, completely unaware of how many people I'd been exposed to. I was surprised, but relieved not to hear about it on the news or anything. That would have been absolutely dire. After running around the Curry Mile naked as fuck for ages, I was initially apprehended by this person I assumed to be a beefy old man, but was actually just a masculine appearing policewoman, who attempted to grapple me to the ground. I imagined I was getting abducted and this guy was going to take me back to his and rape me. I managed to slip out of her grasp, wriggling around furiously like a fish out of water. I escaped for a short while and hid in a car park, squatting and zoning out, but noticing my ego slowly solidifying again. I looked up and was cuffed by several police officers and taken to the hospital in the back of a van. I was spoken to by the driver about what I'd been doing, to which I answered in bipolar sentences that made no sense, and I claimed to be on more drugs than I was on. Like a miracle almost, the officers didn't charge me with causing any mishap, but treated me like utter shit instead at the hospital, throwing me around this painfully dull looking room where I sat and slowly began to root myself back in reality. They began to do this weird thing from before, when it felt like I was having conversations with myself through them, about people they would never know, things that I'd done, and personal encounters that I'd had that only I was aware of. I boiled this down to becoming so hyper-consciousness from the LSD that I became aware that I am actually this infinite consciousness dreaming the self from reality up, and reality is all made out of one substance, which is nothingness. From infinite nothingness bred infinite somethingness, but underneath the facade is just an illusion, all made out of love, all of it dreamed up by infinite consciousness, paradoxes and all. Up till the year 2017, I was a militant atheist, but subsequent ego deaths have only continued to directly verify how this idea of nothingness can be infinite, and how I am everything and nothing all at once, as is everyone, which I am. It's a big time paradox, but consciousness is infinite, so of course it would contain every strange loop and contradiction you can think of. There is not just the sensory, three-dimensional way of experiencing reality which humans are so accustomed to. On the bleaker side of things, it turned out I'd ripped a lot of the skin from my feet from running around on tarmac and pavements for however long I was in the nude for. I also had a fat black eye from the guy who assaulted me. I couldn't walk at all and realised I was absolutely not able to go on holiday the day after. Fucked it, I thought to myself. My parents ended up getting a knock on their door by the police to inform them of the goings on, and they had to come pick me up from the infirmary in the morning. Very embarrassing. They were livid, but mostly happy that I was alive and were especially sympathetic that I'd been through such hell. Obviously, I didn't end up going on holiday and instead was on crutches and basically bedbound for 2 or so weeks due to my messed up feet. Miraculously, these two women who were wired out their heads on MDMA got hit by my phone in the rave, and they ended up leaving me a video on my Snapchat for me to later discover after my mate, whose flat we were initially at, kindly went through to retrieve it for me and gave it back a few days later after he came up and visited. Where would you be without great friends, eh? To this day, this remains my most intense psychedelic experience and became the foundation for what would become a beautiful understanding of consciousness via thorough research, aided greatly by the work of Leo Gura from actualize.org. It also helped me and my friends understand what we are really dealing with when we take psychedelics, and we now use them in a far more productive, conscious, loving manner. Many of us have radically evolved our consciousness and dampened our egos in order to become more loving and understanding beings, as is the ultimate objective of infinite consciousness, or God. If this experience has taught me anything, it was that reality is a dream. And this dream is so vivid and detailed that most of us are so deeply entrenched in it that we take it for absolute reality. These people, or 90% of the population I'd say, are locked in the materialistic paradigm. But for those of us with the desire for an open mind, the curiosity propels us to dissect and understand the mechanics of reality through psychedelics, meditation, etc. And with enough work, the truth can be found and empirically verified within your own direct experience. You can either live in the dream and be aware of it, utilising this to your advantage in a variety of ways, or be completely lost in rampant ego bullshit, creating your own hell. Either way, in the end, none of it matters. We all return to nothing. Peace out. Before we embark on this harrowing tale of psychotic episodes and urinary incontinence, I'd just like to thank you all for the overwhelming reception to my last video. Expect way more of this type of content in the future. I'm definitely going to base my channel around psychedelics more so. I've got numerous stories in the vein of these trip reports up my sleeve. Now, without further ado, let's dive into this one, shall we? This twisted incident occurred sometime during the first half of 2017, by far the most fucked up year of my life for a multitude of reasons, but if you've watched the last part, you probably already realise that. It had been just over a year since sixth form and I was feeling particularly lost in life. Following my time there, a period in which I first undertook the dark arts of substance abuse, my ambitions in life were completely aimless. I didn't have any interest in continuing my education at university, nor was I invested in creating a career for myself. I was just going through the motions at a shitty, dead-end construction job that my dad managed to sort out for me. This was an especially depressing year for me. The job I had didn't stimulate me in any meaningful way, and I was working for an absolute pittance. And somehow, to make things worse, I became embroiled in an exceptionally toxic relationship towards the end of 2016, which only gradually got more and more venomous as the months went on by. Up to this point, I'd never really had a properly intimate relationship. I irrationally assumed that this was my only shot at love due to my lack of any meaningful experiences with women in the past. I clung on to this destructive partner like superglue, and this resulted in some of the most traumatic and damaging experiences I've had to date. So, as you can probably tell, I was boiling in a melting pot of toxicity around this time. There couldn't have been a better time to lose my mind, really. So, it was the night of the Rakes party, a mate of mine that was revered for hosting some of the messiest sessions you could ever hope to attend. My girlfriend at the time was unhappy with the news of my attendance. She would often berate me for going to parties and getting seshed up, which was especially rich because she herself was also stuck in an even deeper substance abuse problem than my own. A terrible combination of people for a relationship, I know, but I was young, dumb, and didn't know any better. Unsurprisingly, I dismissed her disapproval and went anyway. This was going to be a mad night for sure. Me and my friend Buckers had recently picked up some triple dipped tabs earlier in the day and planned to drop several of them for the party. We embarked on our way to the Rakes' abode, eagerly anticipating the twisted shenanigans of the night ahead. Once we rocked up, the sesh was in full swing. Everyone looked to be having a great time, thoroughly intoxicating themselves with the particular poison, and the speakers were blaring some wonderfully mucky, hypnotic beats. After an hour or so, conversing with our friends and soaking in the bassy tunes, we decided it was time to take things up a notch. Me and Bookers took some tabs each. My memory is hazy regarding the amount, but I think I must have consumed at least 450 UG, with Booker's dose also being in that margin to my knowledge. This was my highest dose to date, and I'd been gradually increasing it by 50 UG at every opportunity I got to take LSD, namely at sessions or the occasional fishing trip. Back then, I had little to no knowledge of the higher psychedelic states one could reach for a greater dose. In my previous video, I spoke of the time my friend Keith leapt from my balcony during a fit of his violent ego death, but what I failed to mention was that very same night, another of my friends had an even more chaotic ego death that resulted in a mass brawl at my house, nearly getting trashed from the ensuing chaos, eventually attracting the attention of the police. If I had been wiser and probably understood what my friends went through that night, I would have prevented my own descent into madness. But to no surprise, I naively presumed that increasing the amount taken would purely enhance the visuals and enjoyment of the trip, much like my past few times taking acid. I made the assumption that I was incapable of going as west as my friends had done earlier in the year. I mean, I'd taken acid more times than any of my other mates up to this point. I believed I was a well-versed psychonaut. Surely it would all go to plan. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. Several hours into the trip, I was noticing just how intense the effects were as I laid in sheer hysterics on the bathroom floor, amusingly observing my mate and his girlfriend's jaw flying off whilst they chatted complete and utter shit, wired out their heads on MDMA. It was so hysterical, in fact, that I ended up having to crawl out of the bathroom and run outside for a breath of fresh air. I'd never laughed like this before. I started to perceive existence as a massive joke, of which my life was the punchline. This fit of uncontrollable laughter was not letting up in the slightest, and began to freak me the fuck out. I decided I wasn't in any fit state to converse with most people at this point, and desperately needed to find someone on my level before I lost my mind to the intense bouts of laughter. I went to find Bookers to see how his trip was panning out. I found him in one of the quieter rooms of the house, and sat with him and a few others having some amazingly in-depth discussions and reminiscing on all the great times we've had as a friend group. One of the really beautiful things about acid is actually elevating your love for other people and yourself, and this was the first time I'd ever taken acid and truly realised this. My friends are some of the most amazingly weird individuals you could ever hope to meet, and I realised how utterly blessed I was to know such wonderfully varied people. This was in stark contrast to my experiences growing up, where I didn't really have many friends and found it difficult to relate to people at my school. An immense wave of gratitude washed over me, and I was finally at peace from the debilitating series of laughter. Bookers had the wise idea to roll up a joint for us to smoke at the peak, and being the bud fiend I was, embraced this idea with open arms. Smoking weed on acid in the past felt amazing and really elevated the trip, so naturally I thought this would have gone hand in hand with the 450 UG I took. And luckily, this was not the case this time round. Soon after blazing through the hogger that Bookers had crafted, I noticed the trip began to imbue itself with a noticeably different, almost sinister feeling, vastly different and more alien than any of my previous experiences with LSD. My mind began to fully perceive itself as being some form of godlike entity. Not the orthodox god that we have become so accustomed to having been forced down our throats via dogmatic religion, but the actual god that humanity has been attempting to point to through all of its mystical and religious traditions and practices. Much to my dismay, being an atheist, I sought to detangle myself from the spiderweb of these delusions of grandeur by using logic and reason. I would soon find out that logic and reason are completely impossible to maintain during this ego death experience. I just placed complete and utter faith on them through my egoic existence and the culture that has been imprinted upon my mind throughout my life experiences. The body load began to intensify greatly, and me and Buckers began to discuss things so unbelievably deeply that we both stopped speaking and began to communicate telepathically. As he would occasionally leave the room, I noticed I was able to transmit information to him from my mind whilst he was somewhere else in the house, and in turn I would receive information back from him. Mental, I know, but this is what was happening, and it couldn't have felt more real. I can guarantee if you have this experience for yourself, this will be realer than anything you've ever experienced. To someone who was stuck within the materialistic scientific paradigm at the time, this ethereal, mystical experience knocked me back significantly. It completely destroyed my entire perception of reality, and it was overwhelming in every sense of the word. Just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, Lisa, a girl who stayed in the room and chatted with us through the most intense period of the trip, and who was watching me and Buckers lose our marbles, became limp all of a sudden, flopping over onto the floor and laying there in front of us. I can't speak for Buckers, but I was utterly convinced this girl had just died. One minute she was conscious, the next minute she was completely lifeless. We even moved her around to no avail. There was absolutely no reaction coming from her. Well, this was it. This is what sent me into the deep end. This sight propelled my consciousness into profoundly contemplating the very nature of death, further solidifying my God complex. Soon after, Lisa rose up and began laughing at how fooled we were into thinking she was unconscious. It was pretty funny, to be fair. We were absolutely fucked. This brief return to normality was obliterated after Lisa complimented both me and Buckers on our appearances and how entertaining we'd been. She was enamoured with how weird and amusing we both were and told us we had made her night. As lovely as this sounds, this was it for me. Hearing all this was too much for my feeble ego to comprehend, and right there, like magic, it happened. I died. In that instant, I became distinctly aware that nobody had ever complimented me and my appearance in such a genuine manner, not even my girlfriend at the time. Hearing such heartfelt words washed away a lifetime's worth of anxiety and insecurity over my looks. Baggage I'd been carrying with me my entire life washed away in an instant and was replaced with an orgasmic pulsation that began at my pelvis and reached to the top of my head. A Kundalini awakening, for those of you who know what that is. But, to put it in layman's terms, for lack of a better word, I exploded. There was no Johnny Howard. There was no hard, material reality. There was no other. There was only consciousness in its purest form. Nothingness. I convulsed on the floor in a sea of tears, experiencing indescribable visions of distant, dreamlike worlds like those out of a video game or an animation that extended infinitely in every single direction forever. These bubble realms extended beyond the walls of the room I was in, and I perceived each of them as infinite states of being that consciousness, or God, has been dreaming up in its infinite capability for creativity, with my own relative experience being one of them, but which has already existed for an eternity. I became fully aware of the intercorrelated depth of every single point of reality, both at the micro and macro level. As above, so below, they say. This was awe-inspiring, so much so in fact, that I went absolutely insane. I leapt up and exclaimed with a manic tone in my voice, "Johnny Howard spunked into the universe, go find me, lad." Over and over and over again. I said this because, well, that's exactly what I felt had happened to me. It felt like I had intercourse with the universe itself, and I was experiencing some form of cosmic orgasm better than any you could imagine having as a human. All I could do was speak in utter gibberish about what I was experiencing. I had never felt anything like this before. I ran into the rake's mum's room and jumped onto the bed, squirming around incessantly, screaming and shouting about how I had become everything in existence and also nothing. As you would expect, this freaked people out majorly. Everyone found it funny at first, but it became increasingly worrying to people as I began to throw my belongings around the room, talk to people that weren't there, and attempt to undress myself in front of everybody, throwing my belt at my good friend Ethan, who I had perceived as being a cartoon character. Like in my previous video, notions of experiencing everybody's collective baggage of karma that they'd accrued through all their past lives and current life was being implanted into my consciousness. I entered deeper into the Godhead, and feelings of euphoria washed over my entire body like nothing I'd ever experienced. I believed that this was truly the end of my life. Sometime during my psychotic escapades, I drenched my entire pants in piss. Whilst writhing around on the rake's mother's bed, I lost control of my bodily functions and completely pissed my pants. Having no idea at the time, I believed I'd spunked myself and that nothing was awry, but in reality, everyone had seen me leak a great deal of fluid all over the bed. This prompted me to run to the corner of the room and demand someone give me a knife to end this psychedelic nightmare so that I could properly merge with God. Obviously, everyone refused, but this only made my mental situation worse. I began to see this reality I was in as the end of the entire fucking world, and I could notice auditory hallucinations of rockets being fired, police sirens in abundance, and general chaos ensuing in the streets outside, full to the brim with death and suffering, of which this house was the only respite from such. After an hour or two of being fucking crazy, I asked to see Bookers, but to my dismay, he had fled the party earlier when I started going skits-hydro. I can't blame him though, that was definitely the wisest move you could have made in this scenario. I began to have conversations with people about the state of my life and the experiences I'd had that led up to this moment. My consciousness was talking back to me for other people, and this dissolved any sense of there being other people with their own consciousness around me. It was all just me, God, and in the infinite nature of the universe, I am bound to live through their relative experiences as my own. I fully understood what yogis, shamans, Buddhists, etc., what they really meant when they talked about reincarnation. I have lived infinite lives and will continue to do so for all of time. As will you, because you are me. The very idea of infinity means that all is one. It's so one, in fact, that there is only a single consciousness manifesting what it knows conceptually and experiencing it in what we know of as material reality. But the deeper facet to this is that this is all just one big illusion created by the enormously intelligent capabilities of our senses, creating this world. Every time you open and close your eyes, you literally form reality. I then received a profound insight into the nature of the universe and reality. If you meditate intensely for years on end, or take enough of a psychedelic drug, the barriers of the world dissolve, and you see life for what it really is. A dream. So, following all this, my friends had no choice but to ring up one of my best mates, Manly, to come and retrieve me and to take me somewhere where I didn't pose a threat to myself or other people. I'm lucky that everyone was so open-minded enough to realise the pain that I was actually going through, and that I wasn't actually a lunatic. Manly was especially sympathetic with my plight. He'd seen me go west off acid numerous times in the past when I was first starting out. I was still utterly dazed from this experience. I was so gone, in fact, that I requested he drop me off at my girlfriend's house. Bad mistake. She was not happy to see how mental I'd gone, and in my absence she'd been getting up to some pretty destructive stuff that really fucked with my trip. As the acid wore off and I slowly grounded myself back into reality, I began to sink into a deep depression. I had gone from basking in the glowing warmth of complete, pure consciousness to being stuck in my egoic hell again, bogged down by all the things in my life that I perceived as being bad. But from this trip, I realised that it was all just a matter of perception. Whether you're anxious or depressed, it really is just a matter of perspective and how you see the world. The only thing that's evil or bad about reality is the narrative that we spin to ourselves about it, when in actuality what's happening is just an amalgamation of infinite consciousness's love manifested in physical form, even in the most utterly bizarre and twisted ways you wouldn't egoically think of as a human. The next few days were really tough, and I fully thought I had lost my mind and it would never be coming back. This would actually stick with me up until my trip on the Curry Mile, where everything finally fell into place and I realised what the true meaning of spirituality really is. 3 years on from this event, and my entire life has changed dramatically. I'm no longer depressed, pursue spirituality, and have been truly blessed with the most marvellous loving partner I could have ever asked for, something I couldn't have even imagined having in 2017. Strangely enough, during the most intense point of my ego death, I visualised myself sat on Mount Fuji in Japan, somewhere I have been enamoured with visiting my entire life, what with my autistic enthusiasm for anime and games and Japanese culture. I sat there with someone I loved very, very deeply, and someone that meant the absolute world to me, but who surprisingly was not the partner I had at the time of the trip. This made me question my whole relationship with the other person, and after a grueling few months clinging to them, and after this incident, I finally escaped the distressing relationship that plagued my entire year. As of 2020, me and my amazing girlfriend are planning on travelling Japan in the not too distant future. I know now that my nuclear trip from years before briefly bestowed me with this power of clairvoyance, something else I have experienced in later ego deaths, the ability to perceive the future beyond conventional senses. And the vision of me and my girlfriend on Mount Fuji is something that I am inevitably going to actualise in my direct experience within reality. The trip was telling me that my life was going to sort itself out. The infinite goodness of consciousness that obliterated my ego 3 years ago showed me that everything and nothing is made out of love, and that sometimes the only way to properly know and feel what sanity truly is to go totally and utterly insane. Two weeks ago, my friend managed to link me up with someone in the local area selling trippy chocolates, each of which contained around 30mg of 4-ACO DMT inside of them. I'd taken 4-ACO once a few years back with a mate of mine at a dosage of around 20mg, I think, and it was majorly intense and sedating to say the least, although not as spiritually profound as the experience I was going to have. The substance is often compared to a mushroom trip due to the similar subjective effects and its qualities as a prodrug to psilocin, although this varies wildly from person to person. I'm one of those people it had a radically different effect on. I managed to sort out 3 of the chocolates, but had no clue at first what the exact dosage was for each of them. I deliberated on taking just one, but ended up fully diving into the deep end and consumed all 3 later on at night around 10 PM. I had the lovely idea of just tripping out on my sofa downstairs and sitting through some films I fancied rewatching. The lockdown here in the UK has been especially disheartening, and I couldn't think of anything better to do than get trippy and consume some media. So I got Tokyo Godfathers by Satoshi Kon and Melancholia by Lars von Trier downloaded, and expected myself just to sit through them in a trippy state. It was safe to say that this evening did not go to plan whatsoever. I messaged one of the people who sorted me out with the chocolates, and asked them if they knew the specific dose of each of them. Before consuming all 3 of them, I'd assumed there would only be a minimum of 10mg in each one of the chockies. Nothing too mad. You can imagine my shock upon the dealer informing me that there was 30mg in each one. My heart sank and I was washed over with a debilitating wave of anxiety as I realised what I had just gotten myself into. My friend, who had only ever taken 2 at once, was in pure disbelief that I'd gone the full mile and eaten all 3. I knew that my simple night of tripping out watching some funky movies was not going to play out like I intended. This was going to be far more intense. Even as someone who is very familiar with high doses of psychedelics, the lack of information regarding doses of 4-ACO past 60 milligrams was worrying to say the least. I've had some pretty chaotic ego death-like experiences in the past, and the last thing I wanted to happen tonight was me stripping off all my clothes and pissing on my parents whilst they were asleep. I managed to lull myself back into a state of acceptance as I continued to watch Tokyo Godfathers, a great anime film by Satoshi Kon which was utterly mesmerising as I began to feel the onset of the drug begin to take effect. The animation was fluid beyond all belief. Each facial expression of the characters was impeccably detailed and well animated, and the visuals looked like they had been treated to a dose of high dynamic range via my eyes. I'm far-sighted and wear glasses, but as the 4-ACO was kicking in, I noticed a major improvement in my visual acuity. Everything was going relatively well for such a humongous dose, and the fear was slowly subsiding. That was until the body load struck me in the most immense way possible. I started to have some semi-painful electric shock-like sensations batter my body, and a massive tightness around my chest and stomach gripped me like nothing I've ever experienced. This was spectacularly uncomfortable. I had also eaten very little during the day, so it only took about an hour or so for me to properly start tripping. The film had about 40 minutes left of its runtime, but I couldn't for the life of me concentrate on anything happening. My sense of hearing was all over the place, and the characters' tone, pitch and speed of their voices would vary wildly and fluctuate from scene to scene. It was plainly clear that I was losing touch with all of reality. I noticed the visuals around my front room, and they were subtle yet imbued with the distinct mushy hues and textures, complemented by fractals and hyperbolic geometry, although nowhere near as spectacular as those on high doses of LSD. As the film became exceedingly confusing and my senses began to go haywire, I decided I had to retreat to my bed and ride out the exponentially intense trip. I got in bed and attempted to watch a YouTube video, but I couldn't for the life of me discern that another person had made it and was speaking as their own self. I instead only perceived it as myself talking back to me via this video. As this happened, I noticed I was having great difficulty holding on to my sense of self, as my entire room began to merge with my very being, and my thoughts cascaded into an unbelievably ridiculous series of unfathomable thoughts and contemplations that made no sense, which finally crescendoed into a state of utter confusion as it genuinely felt as if my brain from a physical standpoint was rewiring itself. And now here's where things get even stranger. As I laid in bed and waited for my inevitable foray into the void, I closed my eyes and observed a hallucinatory amalgamation of both wonderful and disturbing visions of creatures and beautiful realms of existence. The heavenly sights and sounds were then juxtaposed with different visions of the staggeringly disturbing degrees of pain and suffering that are potential through God/universal consciousness's ability to dream up infinite dreams for itself to play inside, of which I had the distinct feeling of having been both sides of reality at once, as if I was the yin and yang incarnate. One minute I would envision graceful and playful hallucinations of Wallace and Gromit and my friends and loved ones laughing and cheering whilst dancing in circles in fields of roses, to then be met with an onslaught of demonic energy beings laughing straight at my face and forcing me to focus my awareness on the magnificently unsettling realms of darkness in which unimaginably freakish and disturbing entities and experiences lay in wait. I felt like I experienced every single possible death that a human could experience in one single setting. Despite noticing the fear inside me though, I didn't attach to any of the thoughts or feelings that were coming up. I noticed my ego trying to remain attached to reality at the best attempt it could, but I didn't give it the time of day, and I was able to fairly easily accept the magnitude of love and fear that I was being bombarded with. After this onslaught of hallucinations, I had the profound sense of emerging out of the realm of time and recognizing myself as the only being in the universe. I was no longer perceiving my room, but instead felt as if I was immersed into the very fabric of reality, a timeless void that was littered with infinite dreams, each containing worlds and universes that the average human would only associate with human-made fantasy tales like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. I was guided through this ethereal realm by a voice very similar to my girlfriend that kept telling me, "John, you've made it. This is it. It's been here forever and it'll never stop. We can explore it for eternity. Just you and me." I became aware of my higher self as the Godhead and felt like I had just experienced countless other realms of existence. I'd been reading Berserk earlier in the week, and in my mind's eye I became radically aware of how its universe and characters are contained in a dream as hyper-realistic and material as our very own reality, and that the way humans actually tap into these stories that seem realer than real when we write them down or make a film out of them are actually, in a sense, being plucked out of the slither of potential existence through universal consciousness. All the while this was happening, I had notions of sprinting in this timeless, ethereal void towards the centre of a galaxy-sized vortex that emitted blue light at the edges and radiated the whitest, most purest light I'd ever seen from its centre. As I was running towards this, my consciousness felt as if it was being flung across all possible realms, and I was being bombarded with insights into the nature of reality every single moment I was in this void. The duality between aloneness and togetherness was collapsing, and I became aware that the female voice aching to my girlfriend was actually just me talking to myself, but using my infinite powers of imagination and creativity, I created the illusion of another being that wasn't myself. This rung deeply true inside me, as I have had multiple insights into the nature of truth and have struggled with the existential factor to God's existence and aloneness after many profound ego-death experiences in the past. It wasn't until now that I felt fully accepting of my nature as being all alone in the universe, forever. Because despite it, love can still manifest, and is the only thing that can manifest. It's the only true thing in existence, the substratum of all of reality. Everyone is the only being in the universe. It's a bit like some form of MMO game like World of Warcraft, except there's one central server, the Godhead, which is running all the players, and the ego is just a way of universal consciousness, or God, interacting with reality, of which there are infinite other ways of experiencing it compared to this very small, individuated human experience. The mind of God has fractured itself into countless fragments of itself, or at least it has imagined itself as doing. Beyond this illusion is just pure, absolute unity of all things, and each self contained within this infinite potential space must eventually wake up to itself as the one thing that permeates all of existence, which is God itself. The human mind is incapable of imagining such absolute total unity, because it is too total to allow for a finite mind to exist in it. Within the pure unity there is no difference between a human and a grain of sand. It all blends into one, and I became distinctly aware that this is a glimpse of what happens when your ego dies and you wake up to your true self. There is no death, because there is no end to consciousness. Consciousness is infinite and forever lasting. My glimpse of the infinite white vortex was a sliver of what it was like to exist before you were born, and how my own reality has been littered with clues to enable my awakening process. There then was a tug of war between the female and male energies inside me that seemed to compose duality. My non-dual state was slowly being torn away, and I could feel my ego slowly reforming. I came into my room and felt as if my entire life had been recontextualized. The non-dual afterglow of being aware of my higher nature as everything else in existence stuck for a good few days, and as I listened to music and watched films that I loved, I was fully observant of how parts of each of them I have actually made all of it for myself as totality consciousness. And as I came down from the actual experience, I noticed how I manipulate myself via my interactions with other people, who really are just me in the highest sense. For years this had gave me the fear that I was literally the only thing and that I should be depressed about this, but it's actually something to be happy about, because look around you, look what's potential through just oneness. It's utterly remarkable. I spoke to my girlfriend over Snapchat and was overwhelmed by the immense amount of love I had for her, and felt as if I understood all of her pain and suffering she had experienced in her own subjective life, as if it was my own. But of course, it actually is. I have suffered with the idea of solipsism for many years, but after this mind-blowing experience, I have become more at peace with the truth of reality and see how it is actually a vessel for love and nothing else. It's just how you perceive it through an egoic lens that can prove to make it into a healthy you. The grand ultimate truth is that love is boundless and can manifest in any way the Godhead wishes it to, even if it conflicts with the biased self-interest of a human self. You are not a finite being, as solipsism suggests, but when you realise yourself as an infinite being, you will also realise that you are both alone and together, the true meaning of non-duality, because infinity includes all of these possible dualities. Every dream you dream at night is genuinely somewhere that can be experienced. Every fantasy setting is out there somewhere in some form, in infinite forms, because every time you imagine it within your mind's eye, due to your nature as God, you are actually imagining another possible reality. It literally is infinite in every sense of the word. Pokemon, the series, is literally just a human that's tapped into their higher nature and plucked it out of the infinite realms of possibility and manifested it within human reality, or the human dream that God is dreaming up. I'm so grateful to have experienced such a twisted mashup of both love and suffering via this trip, and I have seen reality in an even clearer way. Alright guys, I'm recounting an old experience of mine today that happened at Boomtown Festival back in 2019. For those that don't know, Boomtown is a festival near Winchester in the south of England, and it's held annually in early August. Around 76,000 people come here, and it's easily one of the greatest festivals in the UK, if not the world, thanks to its immersive storytelling, spectacular environments, so much attention to detail in the way that music is presented. It's not just like a generic festival. Definitely recommend going if you live in the UK, or if you're abroad, get over it. It's probably one of the only reasons to come to the UK. I mean, we've not got much to offer, So yeah, it's a pretty remarkable place, and each year the whole festival becomes more imaginative as the story unfolds over chapters that expand upon the themes and ideas of the previous year. Music is spread across multiple districts, and they represent scenes from all over the globe and throughout the underground. Everything from reggae, roots, folk, ska, metal, punk to techno, hip-hop and house. But the highlight perhaps has got to be the DJ scene, at least for me and my mates, namely drum and bass. Anyone who's into psychedelics or mind-altering chemicals like MDMA knows just how amazing it is to dance to electronic music. It can often be a highly meditative and touching experience to revel in the amplified sensory stimulation amongst thousands of other kind and like-minded people, as well as some of your best mates. It's really a sight to behold. So around 16 of us all arranged to meet up to shred our minds and ignite our hearts for 4 days of non-stop raving action. First of all, the trip down was marred by some serious bumps in the road. Our friend was actually Ketty and couldn't drive his car for quite a while, and we had to pull over and rest at this stop. But that ended up sorting itself out, thankfully. And then we went down south and we ended up in this shop. and my mate Booker's ended up he literally just sort of touched this woman's wing mirror, and then we came into this shop, and before we knew it, there was this big guy, and he was like, "You have disgraced my mother's car. How dare you? I'm going to report you to the authorities," and all this shit. And then he literally followed us around the shop, and then his mum came in and started screaming at us, saying like we were oppressing her. Fucking madness, really. And then when we got to the festival, the security was pretty tight, and Booker's actually got sniffed out by the dogs, and thankfully he didn't have anything on him, but his entrance into the festival was delayed by a few hours due to the search procedures. But everyone else, I think, got in fairly smoothly. So once we all united, we set up shop on a hill near the techno stage called Nucleus. It was an awesome view of the meticulously detailed and colourful juggernaut of a stage, and we'd camped there the year before, and I didn't go in 2017, but all my other mates camped at this spot as well, and it's really good spot. But the thing was, in 2018, it was a bassline and drum and bass stage, so that was more up our alley. We weren't the biggest fans of techno. But being on the other side of the festival meant we got to see more of the districts, and it also made the exodus to Relic all the more dramatic, that being the main stage for drum and bass. A few hours after we'd set up camp, one of the sound engineers smelt the odour of weed emanating from our massive 10-man tent which I was going to sleep in, and instead of reprimanding us, he instead began to roll up and natter with us for a while. It was pretty sound. But it wasn't until several joints deep into the smoke up that he whipped out some fruit pastels that had LSD dust onto them. He was unsure of the dosage though. I already had some tabs on me, so I declined the offer, but a few of my mates took some off him, namely Keith, who will play a part in the story later on. Things were off to a great start, and we engaged in all our usual festival antics throughout the day and into the night. We saw so many wonderfully weird people, watched an amazing amount of mucky sets, and suffocated in the intoxicating aura that Boomtown exudes from every orifice. It wasn't until the next day that things began to take a turn for the worse though. The Friday of the festival was plagued by rampant storms that were battering the UK. Furious winds had obliterated people's camps and strewn them halfway across the festival. 3 of our friends actually came back to the campsite to find their tent completely flat, so the Friday was already in a bit of disarray to begin with. But despite this, the atmosphere had not dulled and everyone was in great spirits. Relic was due to open today, and we all made a plan to fully link up everyone in our group and embark on a mass exodus to the drum and bass realm to see one of the best MCs called DRS, who was performing with the DJ LSB. It was a big fucking deal. So me, Squilkus, Keith and Keka decided to dose up on some acid. Keka and Keith had one of their fruit pastels, whilst I had a tab and a half that I assumed totalled up to 250 UG. I also gave the other half of the tab I split to Squilkus. He didn't fancy taking a fruit pastel and just wanted a mild trip. Me and my then-to-be girlfriend, Elle, spent the first few hours before the set wandering the festival, checking out all the hidden nooks and crannies, discovering an abundance of strange and interesting performance arts and niche music, whilst occasionally fueling up on some ket. It was a great come-up to the trip. Once we all linked up, we were all suitably dosed up to embark on our journey together. A few hours later on our trip to Relic, all of us who had taken acid were on the cusp of the peak, and things began to become very strange. As I was walking, I would occasionally hallucinate naked people walking in between the crowd. At first I thought this was real, but then I noticed that all these people were people that I knew from back home. They would stare at me and pass through people's bodies, and then when I looked back, they would just disappear into thin air. This was especially weird, but I was so far gone that I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. To our dismay, as we arrived at Relic, we were informed by the staff that the stage had to be shut down for the night due to the severe winds. Earlier in the day at Shy FX, the opening act, part of the stage had flown off into the crowd and the set was cut short, so there was obviously a risk of the stage fully falling over, which would have been pretty fucked up. We were all absolutely gutted that we couldn't go to Relic. This was the first proper night on the Friday, and it was the first and only time everyone fully grouped up to see an act together. This threw the group into disarray, since we couldn't all agree on a place to visit together. We all splintered off and went to see other stuff on that we were interested in. I was cut off from Squilkus, Kecker and Keith and went to go to Earache Factory with Elle. She absolutely loves metal, as do I, although not quite as much as I do now. I wasn't really into extreme metal back then. So I decided to hit up Crossfaith, a Japanese metalcore band, who were just about to start playing. The night before this, I was on 2CB and me and Elle went to see Napalm Death, an extremely mucky band who pioneered the grindcore genre. I'd never heard their music, but knew who they were, so you can imagine the shock and terror I experienced whilst being at the front of the audience, getting thrown about by the constant mosh pits whilst on 2CB. It was fairly chaotic, and despite enjoying the music, tripping whilst being banged into every other minute was pretty dire, and I had to leave. So I had it in my mind that this time would be different, and I wanted to make it up to Elle for bailing the night before due to being too fucked up. Funnily enough, the same thing happened again, if not worse this time. We went straight to the front whilst I was peaking, and the crowd was even more wild than the last night. I looked into Elle's eyes and I was obliterated by kaleidoscopes of unending magnitude. Some guy with a horn then bounced up to us and handed it to me and Elle, and we took a swig, not realising it was whiskey. This was truly suffering in its purest form. After 20 minutes into the set, the band beckoned everyone to run onto the stage with them, and I tightened with absolute fear. Suddenly hundreds of people came storming onto the stage behind us, and I literally felt my mind snap into survival mode, and I darted straight out of the extremely dark and sweaty pit, praying to God that I wouldn't get trampled to death on the way out. I made it out and noticed that this jolt of adrenaline had basically triggered an ego death-like experience in me. As soon as I left the crowd, I became distinctly aware of the illusory nature of the self, and how everyone and everything I looked at was just fragments of my own mind. I felt utterly certain that I was imagining everything, and as I would shift my vision around, I interpreted that my lens into reality was reminiscent from your cone of vision in a game like Metal Gear Solid or Minecraft, wherein everything that is being seen from the player's perspective is being rendered so that you can see it, whilst everything outside of that cone, like say the environment behind the player, is just information or data that can solidify into something material when it is perceived. This idea felt ridiculously true, and it started to make sense why we actually engineer games in this way, because is this how reality is constructed via the mind through consciousness? I started to have deep insights into how I was creating reality, which was all just another word for infinite consciousness, which my ego currently is an infinitesimally small fraction of. Elle came out of the stage and I recognised the deep love that was brewing inside of me for her, and that had been catalysed by coming to Boomtown and spending more time together. As soon as my eyes caught hers and watched her smile, I knew that one day this woman would be my partner. It was remarkably beautiful, as is she. Although I was far too psyched out to even begin to explain what was going on and how I felt about her, without sounding like some mental patient, so I just told her that I was panicking and needed some air. She was upset that we had to miss the rest of the set, but she enjoyed just being with me in what would have been a funny sight to behold from her end. We walked around and I began to level out and retain my ego, as I observed the towering buildings and absorbed the cacophony of sounds. The sense of other began to solidify in my mind due to this, and I was able to escape a full ego death, which I imagine could have been disastrous whilst out and about in the festival. However, I was still plagued by occasional nightmarish hallucinations, like the dead people I knew from before, except this time they appeared like living corpses, shambling around and disappearing into thin air, locking me dead in the eyes with their gaze. Me and Elle checked out one of the random tents near Earache Factory and found a band who mainly performed with bagpipes. The music was really interesting, but I was scarred during the performance when I noticed that each of the bandmates had their vision directly fixed onto me, peering into my soul. This was creepy as fuck, but I managed to somehow retain my sanity throughout the set. After this I was sufficiently weirded out, yet somehow things began to get even weirder when I started to feel like I was influencing Elle's actions via my mind. I would perceive her as not talking for ages and only reacting to something when I spoke or pointed something out. And it was so precise that it felt as if I was her. It was as if she was a doll that was directly linked up to my psyche and perfectly responded and reacted to me so as to give the illusion that she was an actual self that is separate from me. This was all happening whilst being drenched in the sweet bassy woods emanating from a jungle set that was being played in one of the forested areas. Boom is over 100 acres in size, so it's easy to get lost amongst all of the different districts and areas within them. Because in each one of these areas there's buildings, you can go in a building, this building leads somewhere else, there's tunnels, there's places you don't even think are places, and you go into them and you're somewhere else. It can be pretty overwhelming, but in the best sense possible. It's an absolute sight to behold. So unfortunately, this is exactly what happened. We ended up getting lost, and we tried to find our way back to the camp to recuperate after my traumatic reaction to crossfaith. But we ended up in a part of the festival we'd never even seen before, with hollowed out trees and hammocks littered everywhere. It was like a hippie retreat almost. This wasn't a problem though, seeing as we were enjoying ourselves. We took some time to chill out here and indulge in some ket whilst we basked in the trippy atmosphere of the lush and vivid environments. This group of lads came up to us whilst we were relaxing in the tree and started speaking in an Australian accent, although I couldn't quite make out a word of what they were saying, and replied extremely basically like, "Yeah man, I get you," and "Yeah, definitely mate," when I had absolutely no clue what they're on about. I think they noticed I was pretty goners as Elle took over the talking until they left. I told her I was surprised to meet some Australian people at Boom, but she left me flabbergasted when she told me they weren't speaking in an accent at all. It was just another one of my hallucinations. At this point I was so fucked that I just had to laugh at how distorted my perceptions had actually become. This idea of physical reality was interpolating with the realms of imagination and producing a dreamlike experience of what I know as the real world. It was mind-blowing. Every time I've had an ego death, it had been building upon this insight into the dreamlike nature of reality and how imagination is so infinite in its power that it can literally dream something like what we know as the physical, material world into existence. With this revelation came the beginning of the come down. I managed to guide us back to the camp during this period and finally grouped up with a lot of the people who had been split up with before. We all shared our crazy experiences and journeys we'd been on in the hours since we all split up before DRS. It turned out that Squilkus, Kecker and Keith had all been together during their peaks, and each had an exceptionally strange experience, namely Keith, who had reverted back into some primal state of being during his ego death, snarling about like a madman. He also shared a similarity he had between me and my trip. To my surprise, he had also hallucinated dead people that he knew as if they were living entities, and also experienced totally unreal perceptions of having been on a spiral-like theme park ride that he wasn't even sure was real, but was sitting next to one of our friends who had passed away a few years ago. It sounded nightmarish, but we both agreed that our profound trips had ultimately been positive and would be another stepping stone towards understanding the nature of reality itself. Funnily enough, Squilkus told me that the half tab I gave him was the strongest half dose of acid he had ever taken and was on the brink of an ego death throughout the peak. This made me realise why my trip had been so utterly mental. The dose of the tabs must have been at least double what I assumed they had been. This, also coupled with the fact that me, Keith and Squilkus had been on a consciousness expanding mission for several years prior to this, and that as you start to understand more about reality, you can become more sensitive to psychedelics, and lower doses you would initially use recreationally, like we did back in the day at sessions and raves and other festivals when we were younger, can become mystical and profound as your own consciousness begins to evolve. So taking one tab now would be like taking 4 tabs back in the day. So all in all, it was a mind-bogglingly weird trip, but would end up serving as the basis for what would become expectant of trips in the future. Once you've glimpsed into the true nature of reality, psychedelics are forever changed, and the days of abusing them recreationally at festivals becomes unsustainable the beginning of your first mystical experience. The rest of the festival was informed by this experience. Each time I would ingest a mind-altering chemical, I was brought back to the vision of the cone of perception I experienced during my trip, how everything in my field of senses is being materialised through them via my mind. It helped me to see that so many of the things I fear and reject are actually a part of myself, and exist in order to be integrated and accepted into the whole of reality, with which I am a part of. So if I can't love myself, I could never love reality. It also sparked the blossoming of mine and Elle's relationship, who I would end up being with in the next few months, and am still happily partnered with to this day. I hope you enjoyed this glimpse into one of my nutty festival experiences. If you'd like to hear more of the wacky stuff me and my mates have gotten up to at festivals and raves over the years, let me know and I'll be sure to share more of them in the future. Peace out, guys.